I was just checking it routinely, walking past with my coffee, and I saw a letter was in the letterbox, in my letterbox. And okay, I thought, what is this? And it turned out to be, the sort of thing that investigative journalists just, live for. It was an anonymous tip. It was a little brown envelope, and it had my name and handwriting in it. And inside it was just a small little letter in handwriting as well. It was in Danish. And it said...
Czech Center for Investigative Reporting and Dark Riviera present Protagonista, a war room content project hosted by Pavla Holcová. Protagonista puts investigative reporters at the heart of the story. Eva Jung is a Danish investigative reporter who will cross continents to knock on doors and demand secrets without blinking. She exposed Denmark's largest corruption scandal, bringing Danske Bank's crimes to light. Eva, how did you get into journalism and then investigative reporting? Because that's a special branch of journalism.
It's a good question, actually, because growing up, I never knew any journalists. I never considered journalism as a path of career. But looking back, I can see that I had, for instance, I found tape recordings of myself as a very young girl doing fake interviews with the Prime Minister.
At the age of?
Yeah, probably around 8 or 9 or something. I was the editor-in-chief of a newspaper at high school, and I still didn't realize that probably journalism was a good direction for me to go. So a little weird, but my background was very different with people working in science, doctors, pharmacists, that sort of thing. And as I said, I didn't know any journalists. So it wasn't until one of my teachers said to Eva, don't you think journalism could be something for you to study? And I was like, that's a good idea. Why hadn't I thought of that? And that's the way it went.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then you studied journalism and started to work as a City Hall reporter.
Yeah, so I was that time being, I thought I was going to go into political reporting. That's the sort of thing you always read about when you're a journalist. These hardcore interviews with politicians, and things, a quickly developing news agenda, and I thought that sounded interesting. But in reality, I think the City Hall reporting was probably a little bit dull.
Why? Boring?
So no, of course it's important, budgets, elderly homes, kids, all that sort of thing. But I think once, every time I had the chance, I would throw myself at stories with a much bigger aim.
Like?
So, for instance, I'd been working at the newspaper for a few months, and this was in the Easter, I believe it was 2010. And there was this big scandal in the Catholic Church in Germany about a lot of kids being abused within the Catholic Church. And just, I was just working on this Easter shift, nothing was really happening. And I did an interview with one of the heads of the Catholic Church in Denmark. And I asked them a pretty concrete question.
Did you ever abuse a kid?
Not that concrete, but asking, do you know of any cases of people that have said that they were abused by any priests that are still active, still living? And I got a very clear no. And we printed the interview, and I remember quite vividly the day after I was in my... I woke up from the phone call. It was early morning, and I remember it was still dark, and the phone was ringing, and it was a guy saying, I read your interview, and I just want to say what they say about no abuse is happening in the church in Denmark. It's not true. I was abused. So this sparked a investigation. I spent a few months along with 2 colleagues looking into this matter. So it had some similar features to what we've seen of these Catholic abuse stories around the world. There was a priest, once he was once someone said that they were abused by him, they moved him abroad. Also another family who told the church that their kid was abused. The priest hired a lawyer, a quite famous lawyer in Denmark, and he started, pressing the family, saying, if you're gonna go forward with this case, it's gonna cost you.
Was it difficult to get approval from your editor or editorial team to give you a couple of months to work on a story? There's never like a clear idea if you will at the end publish or not, if you will be able to prove or not the basic facts. Were they okay with you?
I think this story was what you might call sort of a running investigation. So one story took another. It's not something that we planned to be, one big, investigating for a few months and then publishing. This was more running, and in that sense, I didn't need to ask for more time all the time. It was evident that this was a story of great public interest, and then in that sense, just keep digging.
It's great, because many journalists don't have the support of the editors.
Yeah.
To aim too high.
Yeah.
So you've been reporting from the city hall, and then you just got slightly bored, so you revealed one of the biggest scandal in Denmark, and then you just went back to reporting from the city hall, or?
I think they realized, okay, we'll move her to the investigative desk because we're not getting the city hall reporting we want.
Always looking somewhere else for other stories?
Yeah.
Okay, how does the day of an investigative reporter in investigative team in Denmark look like?
Okay, so we are 6 people working at the investigative desk in Denmark, or in Berlingske in Copenhagen, and we all normally we work together in teams of 2, and
so who is your reporting partner?
I switch around a little bit. I think that's one of the good things in at working at Berlingske. We keep, we cooperate in teams, and sometimes we work with the reporters that know a lot about, what's happening at Christiansborg, the political side. Sometimes we work with people, the reporters that work on climate. We switch around a little, but mostly we work within the investigative group in teams, of course.
So is it like, what police or detective partners say, each other more than if we would be married?
Yeah.
Correct?
So, yeah. I think at the point in time where we did the money laundering scandal, at least, I worked with 2 guys. One was called Simon Benson and one was called Michael Lund. And we spent so much time together for those years, working nights, working holidays, working weekends. We would be in contact all the time. And surely we saw each other more and were more in contact than with our partners and our kids. We just, it took over our life for a while.
So let's get to your next big story, and that's money laundering scandal called Danske Bank scandal. Is there corruption in Denmark?
So it's funny that you should call it the Danske Bank scandal, because Danske Bank calls it the Estonia case.
Of course, there's no corruption in Denmark.
No, which makes it sound like something that only happened in Estonia, of course. But we can call it the Danske Bank scandal here. The money laundering scandal at Danske Bank was a story that we broke back in 2017, and we worked on it for a few years. So this is my colleague Michael Lund, Simon Benson and I, and we worked along the way with our reporting friends around the world. And this was the case of the branch in Estonia of Denmark's biggest lender that just, let a lot of dirty cash run through Estonia, making possible along the way, the laundering of proceeds from crime in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, Azerbaijan. It made it possible to bribe European politicians. Basically, it allowed for a lot of dirty cash to just flow through the branch to all sorts of places.
Okay, do I understand it right that Danske Bank outsourced their money laundering operations to Estonia?
That's a very sharp way of saying it. I would say that Danske Bank, they closed their eyes to what was going on in Estonia.
Yeah. Why?
Transparency International always rates Denmark as one of the least corrupt countries in the world. So if supposedly we are really squeaky clean, I think cases of corruption show up from time to time. But what's really interesting, I think we saw it in the Danske Bank scandal in Estonia, is that some of these big Danish companies have a special ethic, moral standard at home, but once they do business abroad, they slack. Some of my colleagues covered a case of Carlsberg in India, also of corruption and bribing people there. So I think there are, in some cases, a moral, a double standard.
We just talked to people from Serbia and Hungary, and the corruption there it's different level.
Yeah, yeah.
Your work on Danske Bank scandal did not begin like you woke up in the morning and you said, "Oh, I'm going to take down the biggest Danish bank."
This was the time back in 2017. The Panama Papers was a big deal, showcasing how banks around the world had, let crooked actors use their bank. And at that time, Danske Bank was not involved in any sort of major financial crime scandals. But then in I remember it was January 2017, I received an encrypted message from a guy called Paul Radu. He asked us if we wanted to have a look at some banking transactions. I said, of course, we'd love to have a look at that. Paul is known for doing really interesting investigations into financial crime, corruption, money coming out of Russia, the Eastern Europe, that sort of thing. So once you hear from Paul, it's probably interesting. So we said, of course, love to have a look at it. Send it straight away, and it was banking transactions. I involved my colleague Michael Lund and Simon Benson to have a look at this. And to begin with, I must admit we were a little bit disappointed because there weren't that many transactions moving into Denmark.
But okay, I've seen the leak, I work on the leak, and I remember that, the first look is, oh my God, this is going to be this is impossible. You have number of a bank account and another number of a bank account, and then you have as per invoice 217/20/C.
Yeah. No,
so how could you build a story on this kind of papers?
We started discussing, is there any way of other transactions that might be interesting for us? So we asked to have a look at the whole material, the whole leak. And within that, then we started looking for Gibraltar, we started looking for Estonia, we started looking for Lithuania. And in that way, we realized, okay, a lot of money has actually been moving through this branch in Estonia. Once we opened this leak, it turned out that Danske Bank Estonia had been processing, I think, it was the third biggest receiver of money in this leak, in this money laundering case. And at that point in time, we didn't actually know that, we never heard about Danske Bank Estonia before. And it just turned out a lot of weird things had been going on. We were like, what is it that these transactions shows? Let's dig into it. I have to learn how to crack these different transactions. What are the senders? What are the receivers? Why should we be interested in the purpose of the transaction? And you just, you really have to read every single line and do your different pivot tables in Excel. We had to start by analyzing it from the bottom, understanding what are the red flags of a transaction. And
so, what do you consider red flags of a transaction?
So
because you've seen how many hundreds of thousands of such transactions.
Yeah,
your brain didn't blew up or...
Yeah. No, I think sometimes I felt a little bit sleepy going through all these transactions on the computer, of course. The red flags on these banking transactions are, of course, maybe a way of explaining it is, does it look normal? Does this look like a normal banking transaction of someone sending money to someone else? Or are there a lot of weird things happening? So, for instance, the sender, can you see if the sender is situated at an offshore or is it a real company? Can you see if this company in question has employees? Does it have an address? Does it have, activity? A website, that sort of thing. So you can start by checking out the different senders and receivers. Are they real companies or not?
Do you remember that we discussed some of the more absurd, purposes of the alleged purposes of the banking transactions, and there were a lot of like mineral water. They would need to ship pretty much the whole Alps of mineral water.
Yeah.
Or they would. It was like herrings or something.
Yeah, and cheese also. There was
cheese.
Yeah. Really, the money laundering rules tell you that you need to act if you see something that looks suspicious. You need to know your customers. You need to monitor the transactions, and if this does not make sense, you need to tell the police about it, right? So in essence, we did the same thing that the banks are supposed to do. So going through all these transactions, see, does it make sense, or does it look suspicious in any ways?
You started to study and you saw like this huge amount of transactions going through Estonia. So what was the next step?
We needed to, of course, talk to the bank about it. We gave them, I think they had a few weeks. And we did some background meetings, and then we did a proper interview with the bank. And what they told us was that the money moving through Estonia was an example that they had not done enough. And they had some problems at Estonia at the time. But by 2014, they cleaned up everything, and it was by their own account that they sort of recognized what had been going on. So
very polite, proper answer.
Yes, I would say so, but not a fulfilling answer, not a full answer, of course, because we would be able to show for the years to come that a lot of things had been going on, which was not exactly the explanation that the bank gave us.
So, they gave you this interview, and then?
It was the sort of story that would, it raised some discussion on the day, maybe the day after, and then I don't think people really cared a lot about it. It was quite technical. It was quite dry, I think.
Investigative reporting is dry.
It is dry, yeah. But, in the end, we would be able to do much more explosive stories. But this was, to begin with, I think it probably raised more questions than it gave answers.
That's good.
That's what we would spend the time coming to try to answer more of these questions.
No, I mean, like, there was some time, and then you dig into much bigger story about Danske Bank, because this was just the first round,
Yeah. So I remember vividly a day it was the spring of 2017, and we have this pigeon letter boxes or something like that in English. I was just checking it routinely, walking past with my coffee, and I saw a letter was in the letterbox, in my letterbox. And okay, I thought, what is this? And it turned out to be, the sort of thing that investigative journalists just, live for. It was an anonymous tip. It was a little brown envelope, and it had my name and handwriting in it. And inside it was just a small little letter in handwriting as well. It was in Danish.
Can you describe the note? Because my imagination really started to
Sure.
Was it paper with lines and
inside the note was a handwritten letter. It was a lined paper. It
just
was sort
randomly
of like,
torn from.
Yeah, so it was so clumsily cut off in the bottom. It was just a small single page, and it had big round handwriting. It seemed like someone had just clumsily put down on the paper and just send it off, before they regret sending it. And of course, one of the things you can't help to notice every time you meet someone, you want to ask them about their handwriting.
Right. So who did you imagine was the sender?
Yeah, so I still don't know who was the sender. And actually, you think about that for years, of course, who might be the sender. But I think it's realistic that it must have been someone within either the bank itself in Denmark or within the financial authorities.
Okay, I wouldn't speculate more if it was like
I don't know who
cat
the sender
lady
is, so you can
or...
speculate anything you want. Yeah.
Okay, I will imagine a cat lady, who just read the article and said,
yeah.
Now
I still
really
have
upset.
it, and I take it out sometimes, and I look at it, and I really, cherish that someone would send a tip like that, because it's really important that people have the courage to help journalism, go forward in a case like this.
Let's get back to the story. So you took the letter.
Just a small little letter in handwriting as well. It was in Danish, and it said, money laundering, ask Danske Bank if they received a warning from the Russian central bank back in 2006 about suspicious currency transactions. There was no name of anyone sending it, there was no date, there was no address, so it was just really a tip, someone who thought this information was important for us to know. And I remember just, taking the letter in my hand and running down to Michael Lund and Simon Benson, my colleagues that I worked with on the case. And we were just looking at it, and there was so much explosive information in it, because at this point of time, we knew that there had been some problems in Estonia at the branch. They said they cleaned up many years ago, but then it turns out that if what the writer was saying was true, there had been warnings to Danske Bank already by the time they purchased this branch in Estonia. And these warnings came from the Russian central bank.
So it must be a really, really bad situation.
And they were talking about suspicious currency transactions already by then. So if the sender of this letter was right, then the branch in Estonia had that problem for many, many years, and they had been warned about it. So, of course, that just made you think this story might be much, much bigger than we anticipated, and it set us out on a quest to, find out what had been going on at this branch at Danske Bank, and why hadn't they reacted on it by the time, It wasn't until 1.5 years later that we actually got, an answer saying this actually happened. What the person writing this letter wrote was true. But of course, it fueled a big investigation into the branch and what Danske Bank had been doing. But we didn't get the answer to that specific thing at the time.
But also, what the hell must be going on if Russian central bank is giving the warning?
Exactly.
So what was going on in Russia when...
So what we found out a few years after is that by this time, there was a guy called Andrei Kozlov in the Russian central bank. He was the vice chief of the Russian central bank. He was on a quest to close down crooked banks in Russia, and he was moving around Europe, telling different banks to clean up. And we found out that he had also been to Estonia to talk to the authorities there to say there's a bank here in Estonia and Tallinn that is letting money from crooked activity in Russia run through its bank accounts. So you need to do something about that.
So he was a good guy.
So he would probably be what you said is a good guy. Yeah, a very good guy. What's really sad about it is that just a few years after warning about this branch in Estonia, which was at the time being sold to Danske Bank. So what's really sad about it is that just a few months after, he was actually killed. He was murdered in a parking lot in Moscow along with his driver. They were shot down. And So the warnings about all these crooked banks died with him. I think Andrei Kozlov had a lot of enemies within the political and the financial system, and he was not. It wasn't a popular thing to close down crooked banks, because where would all these different criminals then send their money through?
Okay, so how did you proceed without, having just this letter and nothing else?
So at the time, we also started receiving some anonymous phone calls from people saying, "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg, keep digging." For one thing,
bank, no one's gonna give you any sensitive documents.
Exactly. So the bank's not gonna give us any documents, and all the different financial authorities is not gonna give us any documents, because there's the bank secrecy. We need a new network of sources. We need to find people that actually knew what was going on, either at the bank or at the authorities working with this. And once we started talking about this, actually it turned out there's quite a lot of people you can ask that might know something about what went on. It's not certain that they want to talk to you about it. Actually, it's quite certain that they don't want to talk to you about it, but you have to give it a go, right? So it's really, I think it's the first time I've done it. We just decided we wanted to go on a major fishing trip around Europe, trying to find these different sources that might help us.
Fishing trip as going and try to fish for new sources.
Yeah, trying to fish for documentation, information, and fishing, of course, you never know if you're gonna hook something, but if you get someone to take the bait, it might be worthwhile.
Do you like bothering random people?
I like speaking to random people. That's one of the things I think is best. The best part of my work is meeting new people and trying to, get them to talk, because they have something important to say.
So one morning you decided to go, and you got on a train, car, I don't know where.
So at the point of time,
because you're going to Europe, and Europe, it's like it could take a year to travel Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we had a list of the most important names, and I remember setting out to meet one of these sources. And I was going for the weekend. I wanted to meet this person at their home. So in order not to, raise any suspicion at their workplace, it's better to meet them at their home. It's better to meet them in person, so you don't leave any digital traces, that anyone could be interested in afterwards, and knock on their private home door. So
in
I decided,
evening or very early morning when they are home.
I found it best to knock on people's door Sunday night. So when they're relaxed at their home, and they don't have a lot of things. Normally, people don't have a lot of things to do on a Sunday night. So I remember one of these times thinking a lot about what to say, even what to wear. You want to look trustworthy, and you also want to look. You don't want to scare people, right? Another thing is,
how does it go with your clothes?
So that's another thing. What do I want to look like? Do I want to look like someone they know from their own world? So going to speak to a banker, I would probably wear a nice shirt. If I was going to speak to someone working with the law enforcement, I would wear something a little bit more casual. So I don't know if it does a difference in the end, but for me, it makes me feel more prepared at least.
Do you remember what you wore exactly the evening when you were, freezing out, but there was the light in the window? And you rang the doorbell?
I do remember what I was wearing, but then if I tell you what I was wearing, it might show you what kind of source I went to visit.
Okay.
So I can't talk about that.
Okay.
But giving a lot of thought to what their motivation might be to speak to me. There are a bunch of different motives why people might want to speak to a journalist. It might be, justice. It might be revenge. It might be, people just liking to hear themselves talk. A lot of different motives. So I remember my hands freezing, and I was looking up. I could see there's light in the window. Okay, so someone's home. Might it be the person I want to speak to? You never know. but I knocked the door and, you have 2 minutes to convince this person why should they talk to this complete random stranger standing at my door. The easiest thing is just to say, no thank you, and close the door. So you need to be very quickly both polite and to raise their, interest in why I'm interesting and why they have something interesting to say. So normally I will say something like, because I've done it many times by now, that I've come all the way from Denmark. I'm here because I want to speak to them about this certain case. I know they know a lot about it, and I know that it can be probably quite overwhelming that I'm standing here at their private door. And of course, once I've explained them what I want to talk to them about, if they want me to leave, of course I will. So trying to be polite and not to scare them, and in the same time, making them want to speak to me. So many of the times that we went out on these sort of quests, people would just say no thank you, and either call the bank, or one time there was even a guy who sent a dog running after us. But once in a while, a few times, pivotal moments, we would be let in. And coming back to this time where I was looking back at the lights in the windows, that's one of the times I was let in, and I would sit there and talk for a few hours with this totally key person, and this was someone that I would be able to get back to time after time for new information. So coming out of this meeting, I remember, heart pounding, and I went to a bar with my laptop and I ordered a big drink, and it was a major breakthrough. So it was, I just wanted to get it all down in a document.
So your fishing expedition, what meant freezing outside, doing this psychology, journalism magic to be let in, it turned out to work.
Yeah. Different expeditions gave different things, but one of the times we went out, we got access to a whole new data set of transactions running through Danske Bank Estonia. This was to become a major, investigation across Europe, a big cross-border investigation with our colleagues. It catalyzed a few different things. This was a trove of banking transactions that we called, in the end, the Azerbaijani laundromat.
The final blow to Danske Bank.
Yeah. So quite quickly we could see that this was a different league than what we had worked on before, because we could see within the purposes of the transactions, real names were appearing. So names that sounded like European people. And it turned out to be, once we started Googling these names, that they were names of politicians.
Like?